Hi, I'm Lauren Lavoie, and this is entitled The Mechanics of Mind. And I'm just going to illustrate how I perceive the ego-mind dynamic, how it functions. And so if I use the term ego-mind, basically um, the, the ego-mind structure is a kind of bubble around the consciousness. And so the consciousness and the mind are two different things. The mind is a material, ego-based tool, in a sense, not really intended as a guide. The consciousness was intended to guide us. So um, let me just say that um, there's a movement of perception and consciousness that's driven by the will of your consciousness that doesn't have to be filtered by the ego. Consciousness is interconnected. If it's expanded, it can be interconnected to other consciousnesses. So, and that's why I'm going to get into fracture, the division of mind, and how the mind fractures reality in order to create values, hierarchies, um, to structure ourselves in a particular state of superiority or inferiority. So in essence, the ego basically it inverts and then reflects our true content or the nature or natures of our content back to us. And this is happening. When this is happening, we're inside the sphere of the ego mind construct. Let me go ahead and read you a quote from Albert Einstein. A human being is a part of a whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So this is, a simple quote that Einstein felt necessary to make. The way that he describes what I'm going to speak about and dismantle for you is a kind of optical delusion of the consciousness. The consciousness doesn't undergo any real change other than the fact that the realm that the ego resides in, the illusion realm, can and has and will continue to impose belief, egotistic or illusion-based belief upon the consciousness. And so this doesn't mean that the consciousness is restricted. It may appear that the consciousness is restricted in terms of acquisition of different types of states of elevation or expansion in your environment, whatever that environment is. The way that the thing is, it's difficult in a sense to. I had a lot of issue with the mind and the ego, and one of the things that I'm going to explain to you is how to live outside of the confines of the illusion realm. So you have to understand that the illusion world is simply a projection of the illusionary mind. Um, you know, and I want to say at the start that it's not necessary for you to understand the intricacies of this mechanism and the difference between the egotistic mechanism and the consciousness in order to acquire a lifestyle of fulfillment, peace, serenity, etc. My point is that I say that primarily because of truths are dynamic. Truths are dynamic because they're housed in an environment of change-filledness. And so what I'm sharing with you now is my current understanding of how these things work. And you may have, none of this may not work for you. I don't know. What I've done instead of throwing philosophies, principles of philosophic thought or principles of living, and there are some foundation principles that can't be ignored. They must be adopted in order to develop and acquire freedom and peace internally, etc. But what I've done in my work over the last few years is I've studied, I've cultivated a way of breaking down our human natures into, well, just that. There's our human nature, and then there's our human nature that is counter, in purpose, with purpose, counter to our human nature. Or I would say there's our spiritual nature that is housed within a human nature, and that human nature has, an egotistical or shadow self, illusionary mind, illusionary self, whatever the word would be. I'm going to explain how all that works in terms of fundamental structures. And the reason why I'm doing that is because if you can start to see, if you have the interest and you need or want to see the difference between a life that's guided by the mind and a life that's guided by the heart, these what I'm about to share with you will help you do that. So what I'm showing you here are simply the lower earth. The representation of earth is what I'm going to refer as the reality, the great reality. And as the great reality is, consciousness can directly, and it's really important for me to tell you, when I say literally, I really mean quite literally. The consciousness is capable of interacting with the great reality, or what I'm going to call it, spiritual reality. In other words, the natural, living, change-filled world that is not being perceived through a filter of the mind. That's what I mean when I refer to this sphere is represented by Earth. Now, the illusion world is just that. It is an illusion, but it's not real. So, in other words, the illusion realm is residing or resting on a structural frequency that is based on, in other words, the manifestation or the projection of the illusionary world is second to the manifestor or the creator of it, which is the ego-mind dynamic, in my opinion. Okay, so given that it is material in nature, so it's not, the illusion itself is not spiritual in nature. It is illusionary, and it functions on a particular frequency, and as a result of it being material based, just like thought, it is held and can gain a kind of weight to it. It can gain weight, and it is acted, it's held because it's acted on by gravity. So you can't ride any illusionary structure or idea or concept or pleasure into a spiritual state. It's not possible. And it's really critical for me to point out right now is that egotism and spiritual consciousness or spiritual reality, those two will never occupy the same space in terms of your direct experience at the same time. It will never happen. It may appear that it happens, but it doesn't happen. They are literally two different kingdoms in a sense. And if you've been paying attention at all, you'll know that people have dedicated an inordinate amount of effort and treasure in building in the illusion world. And it is a very heavy, powerful world. The conditioning that emanates from the illusionary kingdom it's unbelievable. It's amazing. So it's not if you've become entangled in mental obsessive, self-centered obsessive issue, that's normal. My work is to help you live outside of that. In my opinion, there's no reason to invest any effort in the egotism or the illusionary kingdom. As you can imagine, that I call it a kingdom because if you've got enough people in agreement with realities, in a sense, or illusionary realities or concepts, when there's a degree of agreement, when there's an amount of agreement, then you've got a place within or outside of the spiritual realm, which we can be harbored in or develop a kind of cocoon in. And so it's twofold, and you'll notice in the next several minutes that I will refer to duality often, because especially when I'm speaking about the mind, and in this reality, in this nature, there's an inordinate amount of complicated divisions or fractures that are based on fundamental duality. And so I basically tend to stick to fundamental dualism. And you'll understand very quickly why that is. When you've got a fundamental truth, a living fundamental truth such as equality, in that respective to spiritual reality, there is no one entity that is more valuable or more precious than another. And so that is what I'm terming equality. Now, the moment that essence, living nature or truth is taken, or held, or perceived through the mind, you'll have a base dualistic fracture of that. And as you might imagine, if you can take a minute to think about what would equality be fractured into relative to the mind's perceptual workings. And what I'm going to say about that is that that probably went right on my face, didn't it? The mind, what the mind does with equality is it fractures it. It may be very subtle. You may have a degree of psychological or, um, you may have some trauma behind these two things, these two dualistic halves of the whole nature equality. So it may be subconscious, and it may be very pleasurable. But basically what happens is equality is fractured into superiority and inferiority. Or you can say any word that is associated with those two words. A living definition obviously is much more complex. So I'm again telling you that I'm giving you the basic structural fracture of spiritual reality. And the reason why this occurs, if an individual if part of the purpose of an entity is to develop a particular aspect or a number of aspects of their true nature that they have not developed in the spirit realm before they get here, you'll find that you'll have a lean towards certain difficulties. And you'll notice that other people, relative to those specific difficulties that you have no trouble with those. They'll have a nature that has easily mastered certain trouble, like unification. An individual that is here to master or develop an understanding. And when I say understanding, I'm not speaking about conceptual understanding necessarily. I'm speaking about a developmental form of maturation relative to the need to acquire an understanding of unification. And so if you have that issue where you have the need to develop an understanding of unification, then you may have some major divisive attributes in your character. Okay, so this is a very simple diagram, and I kind of just keep it up here to so that you can refer back to it as I'm speaking. If you think about divisive nature, jealousy is divisive in the sense that you've got. Well, let me before I get into that, let me explain some of the laws that kind of govern the presence or activity or activation or execution of the ego. One of the laws that when I said earlier that ego and spiritual reality can't exist in the same place twice, the reason why that is that you'll see why it is. The moment that an individual takes action on their nature, they will encounter within themselves a kind of fulfillment that will displace the ego. It'll displace the ego from their actual or living relationship with themselves and reality. It's true that you can take action on your nature and not experience a shift in your consciousness if your system's polluted, if you're literally cut off from the network of the living reality, or there's such a degree of ignorance that the the light that would emanate from that fulfillment, you can't perceive it. You don't know how to acknowledge it or embrace it. And so there are these, you know, secondary and tertiary issues. But the basic law, the fundamental law about, in other words, because the ego, because the ego mind is a illusionary entity, because I should say this, I should say that the ego consistently and constantly, whether you're aware of it or not, will invert and reflect back to you your true nature. So your true nature, relative or according to or through the filter of the ego, will be projected toward your experiential observer nature, your consciousness, as a fracture. And so that's what you would feel inferior to another human being or another human being's attribute. To say if they're particularly, you know, witty and quick to respond spontaneously, you know, can consistently come up with something hilarious to say, etc. You may look to see a lack of that character in yourself, and that may be true. You may not be a witty individual, but regardless of the truth of what the content of your nature, regardless of that, the ego will be there. If you see it, pay attention to it, acknowledge it, run with it, whatever, the ego will tell you that you have an inadequacy, comparatively, to another, whatever. So whether it's physical, emotional, intellectual, you know, material, whatever, the ego will always, you know, and it may not be true at all. You may be ignorant of your true nature, the content of it. But the ego will always provide us with the first fracture of deficit, and they have too much, I have too little, or I have too much, you know, and they have too little. So it's always going to do this. So we just, you know, break into the second split, which is, in order for me to indulge a state of superiority, I have to have a comparative entity in the dynamic. So obviously, if I'm the only person on the planet, I wouldn't have an issue with superiority or inferiority. The moment there's more than one person in an environment relative to each other, then you have comparison. And you will understand that the ego can't function without comparison. And it was interesting to me about taking some of Einstein's, you know, his illuminations of physical reality and applying it to psychology and spiritual development. So in essence, this is, you know, it's exactly why when you get into a relationship, when you get involved, and the subconscious becomes part of the arena, which is, you know, the conscience itself is housed in the pelvic chakra. And so the moment that there's sex, the moment that there's, whether it's egotistical sexual experience or it's consciousness, heart, you know, sexual experience, it's going to trigger the subconscious and the conscious. So one of the interesting things to me is that an individual that believes that they're superior to another, that's in a conscious state where their superiority is conscious for them, will, as far as my experiences govern my belief system about this, they will be suffering the other end of that, the other side of that coin. They will most likely, as far as I can tell so far, they will feel subconsciously inferior. And so that is the work, in my opinion. If an individual can learn which beliefs or trauma or conditioning or abandonment issues, neglect, whatever it was, where they adopted a belief that they were inferior and then chose the conscious end of it to project the opposite end of it and to build the opposite end of it. So in other words, I had a great deal of trouble with superiority. So, but in mechanically, what I was doing is I was compensating for a deep sense of extremely believable inferiority, inadequacy. You know, I was always compensating for that, and it didn't really matter what others, how they perceived me or not. Anyway, so you can see how the reason why I said some of what I said is because you can't directly dismantle or alter the ego. And in terms of thought and the mind and the belief system and understanding and conceptual evaluation of things, that to me it's profitable to a point. But again, the problem with, let me get rid of this and bring up this. The problem with, like, say, adopting positive thinking. That's a real popular New Age, solution to. It's not even a solution, because basically what's happening is that, remember that if I say, well, I'm just going to think positively, and there is a difference between having an active, creative, hopeful outlook. I'm not talking about hope. Hope and positive thinking share no common ground, in my opinion. They may seem to, but they really don't. Cultivation of hope is far greater of value than compensating for, and I go back into this, the compensation for negative thinking with positive thinking it'll just turn you in circles. The idea is to live in a way, internally and externally, that you're not even aware of fracture, of negativity, You're not even aware of the illusion of inadequacy or deficit, So the reason why it gets more and more severe as we age for some reason, but I want to share with you just a couple dualistic fractures from, just so you have, the tools to work with. When the mind fractures equality into it's dualism. It's the dualistic states, the illusionary state, superiority and inferiority. There's again another fracture, and what the mind does is it because it has now something to work with. You could call it an object of sorts. When you believe it, it becomes kind of a substantial object. There's a point where if you look farther, you'll notice that it's really kind of peculiar to talk about this. Very difficult in a way. Because there is the issue of doubt. Self-doubt, suspicion of others. That's another fracture. I'm bringing it up because what happens is because the mind doubts, because reality is absolute in its realness, the ego mind will doubt its very existence. And so if you're in the ego mind, um, if you're really in it, the ego mind will tell you that there is no other reality. It just doesn't exist. And you may believe that. I did for quite a while. But basically the doubt is really, it's kind of really interesting, because and you can test the degree at which you are suffering from self-delusion, if you'd like, by invoking or projecting or moving or willing yourself to move towards the unknown. This is one of the things that will threaten the ego. The ego doesn't like to deal with unknowns or vagaries or mysteries. Just unacceptable to the ego mind. And the reason why that is because the ego mind, the ego believes that it's the only real, it doesn't believe that your true self, your true nature is real. And so it's never going to suggest a conflict of interest and say, well, maybe you should ask your heart, what the right thing to do is. The moment that the ego is given attention, especially when we rely on it for guidance, then it will never suggest anything in terms of looking toward or looking to the heart for advice, ever. It will never do that. And it will never suggest that you allow everything to be as it is. It's a control-based mechanism. And remember, it's control-based because it is it's inverting your true nature. Your true nature doesn't need to be justified. It doesn't need to be just that. It doesn't need justification. So it's really different moving back and forth from the consciousness and the ego mind. So anyway, back to the second fracture. The second fracture is that it's basically a justification or reason why I'm provided by my mind, a reason why I am superior to you. Okay? And my superiority is based on whatever reason. But there's always a justification that follows a belief, an illusionary belief, okay? And so if my inferiority is based on a lack of material wealth or status, prestige, recognition from my peers in my field of study, etc., whatever. And so now, if you want to, you can, and I would just, I would do this kind of maybe in meditation. Definitely do not, pursue, would not recommend pursuing, not taking a trip, in an imbalanced state of mind into the ego, and it's really not recommended. But you'll see that you would probably not survive the fourth or fifth fracture. So at that point, and I'm not going to speak about them, there's a point where insanity becomes a place of mind or a state of mind, because the fractures have fractured and inverted and fractured and inverted, okay? So you get into schizophrenic states here, where the personality itself and the identity, the core purpose for existence, in other words, if you go that deep into the egotistical world, or the illusionary world, you'll encounter fractures and inversions of your deepest core nature, and you don't want to do that. There's no reason to do that. That's the kind of thing that would happen on LSD or not. Well, marijuana is a really retarded drug in that the way that it enhances the activity of the intellect so much that, well, you can do this without any of that. You can understand how the fractures occur, but you should have enough examples in your life, to follow this reasoning along here. So, very quickly, the there's no real way, to get around the ego. It can't be destroyed. It can't be overcome. It can be mastered through right living. And so, the idea, is to the idea is always to. It's really an issue of honesty or humility. Humility is honesty, and honesty is key because it's not so much that there are these particular actions that are right actions for us that we need to take on a consistent basis so that we can stay in that state. The motivation behind the actions you take is critical. If you want a true departure or freedom from the illusionary, form of perceiving reality. And so motive is result. So the basic, just in summing up, I would just, the idea is to, in my opinion, the best place to start is in meditation. And because in meditation you can sit still and position yourself inwardly towards the center, let go, allow all of the sensations within and without you to pass without interference, which means to not resist anything, to not enhance anything or minimize anything, but to allow what you're experiencing to just allow it its space. Be respectful of the ego. Allow the mind its space. If you resist it, if you resist the mind's activity, that resistance is a form of energy. And so when I guess the Buddhists speak of entanglement, basically what they're speaking of, entanglement is the movement or the pressure, the will, resisting or modifying a state of mind that we're in the attempt to derive pleasure from it or to escape from it, etc. So you understand that if you're real and you're trying to escape from something that's not real, you're going to generate, you're going to give that unrealness more and more reality to you. And so you can enhance a fear by resisting it to the point where all you can experience is that fear. And, as you probably know, that fears are funny because they're always about to happen. Fears haven't, in a sense, already happened. You know what I mean? So there's some kind of disconnect here about the fear of loss, the fear of being deprived of something that we truly need, truly believe we need, and when's it going to happen? And of course that's nebulous, but if you really think about it, well, I'm saying if you really look, you'll notice that loss, the fear of loss, is based on probably your first actual loss when you were a child somewhere. And the reason why, the thing is, what's really interesting in a sense is that, and good to know about the ego, is that it's not capable of creativity. So it's not, it can intermix or juxtapose, certain fears based on experiences from your past, etc., in different ways with different lighting or different whatever, different causes, etc. It gets really complicated. I don't really want to get into the complicated aspects of the ego, but it's not capable of creation. So, and that's why a lot of times any creative act will allow you a degree of peace. And it's not so much that, someone is talking about, well, how do you escape? How do you free yourself? How do you acquire freedom, etc.? Well, freedom, like equality, is a constant. It's a fact. It is a place that exists in conscious, real world conscious reality. And so it's not so much that you need to acquire peace or freedom, serenity, or power, whatever. If you're in that state, then you've already abandoned freedom. So if you're disconnected or cut off, then you have to look at what you did to isolate yourself illusionarily, if that's a word, from the world of freedom. So the kingdom of freedom, however you want to phrase it, the world of freedom, the great reality. You have to look at what point, what beliefs or what conditioning did you not deal with that altered your life course to live an unnatural life for you and not pursue your dream life, what is truly dear to you and all that. You have to find out, because the reality of freedom and ecstasia, all of those states, they're quite accessible, but you can't, again, access them from illusion. And so if you want to take a serious look at the support of your illusionary environment, what you'll want to look at are your core beliefs, your core false beliefs. And it was shared with me that my two core false beliefs, that the justification for my ego rested upon, were the belief, and these aren't fears. Fears come after beliefs. So my two core false beliefs are the belief that I will fail and the belief that I'm not good enough. And so I spent, some years cultivating adequacy, needing approval and permission and striving for that, and and having successes, and it helped. But these actions were relative to my ego, which bound me to my ego, because I was still taking action to escape from or to prove these false beliefs unreal to me. And so if you're ready to, if you're tired of the burden, the weight, and ego is its own depression maker, and it's its own problem maker too. If you're tired, then you'll want to engage in, really an internal search, relationship with your true nature, your true self. And as you do that, and as you take actions for the betterment of other, you'll start to notice that the stagnant, in other words, the energy, the power that was intended to be taken on your true nature, the degree at which that power is not acted on, it will slide over into the ego and manifest that. And that heaviness of the ego will become greater and greater over time. This is all progressive. So anyway, I'm gonna wrap up here, and then I'll continue on with part 2 of this. Anyway, thanks very much.